exciting episode of PEEPanEIP, an educational video series where we learn about an Ethereum improvement proposal, upcoming upgrades, and the basics of Ethereum blockchain. In this episode, we'll be learning about the merged testnet and the progress made by the client teams of execution and consensus layer. And our guests are two of the popular researchers and developers, Parithosh J and Protolambda. Welcome both to the PEEPanEIP.
Hey.
Proto is our first-time guest and is currently working on Ethereum scaling and R&D. And you already met with Parithosh on the talk on beacon chain metrics. It's always fun to know our devs. So before we get into the presentation, may I request Proto to share about the professional history and how you find Ethereum, and maybe Parithosh can follow with a quick introduction for our new followers.
Sure. Yes. Around the start of Ethereum to the new design, where we start to have this beacon chain, I joined the Ethereum Foundation to help with testing, optimizations, and what drew me to this thing is that we could finally scale Ethereum. Today, I'm working on different kind of scaling on rollups, but this past year we have worked on lots of past testnets, and what I'm trying to get to is this Ethereum Niframa with proof of stake and sharding.
Hey, I'm Parithosh. I work at the Ethereum Foundation as a DevOps engineer, and I'm usually helping out with coordination between client teams and with testnets.
Thank you both. Thank you for the introduction. I know we have got an interesting presentation to dive into. So without further ado, let's peep in.
All right. Okay, so I'll start the presentation. A quick note about the merge. So we can talk a lot about these testnets, but without context, it will not make as much sense. There is this big infrastructure change, whereas the current execution layer and beacon chain layer, they still exist, they'll still be there. It's just that they're now combined. And what we get is this two-layer system to introduce proof of stake. We have the consensus layer and the execution layer. And basically the execution of today we maintain, but the proof of work is what we stop. And we can then introduce proof of stake. So I'll talk a little bit about how we achieve this. If you can go to the next slide. There's a lot to it. So we have different specs for the consensus layer, for the execution layer, and the communication between these two layers, which is called the engine API. And as part of the execution layer, we have EIPs. For the consensus layer, we have a specs repository where we introduce these changes. And you can follow the very latest specs on this link here, spec.merge.wiki, if you want to keep up to date. These things, they change every other week. It's hard to track, but we try and bridge between all the client implementers to have them all join the same testnet. And then we are also tracking how well these clients are doing, how far along they are. We have client milestones. And then we can go to the next slide about the EIPs. So we have this previous PEEPanEIP, I'd recommend, where Mikael explains how the proof of stake EIP works. But in summary, it means we set a total terminal difficulty. This is where the proof of work stops, where we have reached a maximum amount of work, and it forces the system to move to proof of stake. And then there's this EIP goes indeed in depth how this transition works. Very important piece. For testnets, we're just repeating it over and over again to make sure it works, and we covered all the edge cases. Then there are some subtle other differences with the EIP that, for example, we need to limit a few of these fields within the block header. There are mostly technical details. And so yes, we stop proof of work. we stop awarding block rewards through proof of work, but instead we have the beacon chain that has proof of stake and a validator system to build blocks. And then to the next slide, we have another EIP. So this one is newer. It's less important. It's smaller. So these are the EVM changes that you'll see with the merge. It will probably be covered in the EIP soon, but this is what the implementers have to worry about aside from the transition. So the execution clients implement this change to support randomness in the EVM and to fit it as well as possible in the previous EVM. So we use the difficulty upcode because it's similar to randomness, and previously it used to be like this hacky solution by dApps to have some randomness in the EVM. It's not recommended. It's kind of gameable, but this retrofits it as well as possible. We have the mix hash, so we use the same header field, and through the same minimal change, you can also detect if the merge happens from within the EVM. So if your dApp is affected by block time or something like that, this is definitely something you could use. And right, so this is the interesting bit. This is the thing we are we're using to connect these two layers. And also the thing that's changed the most, and we hammered it down from, I think, 7 different API methods to a really elegant design of 3 API methods. And so you can memorize them, they're easy to understand. And this separation of the layers, but with communication between them, it enables encapsulation. So we can have a different team working on the execution layer than the consensus layer. I said we can move faster. This is parallel development, and also it minimizes the risk, right? Because we have existing software that's true and tested. We make minimal changes to combine it and to get to the merge. And so this API consists of fork choice updated. It says where we're going, and if you're a producer, it also means that you start building a block if you're next up. Then there's a method to fetch the production work, and then there's a method to add to the local chain to extend your chain. These are all the changes, the different EIPs and the ancient API that the merge introduces. On the consensus layer side, there are a lot more specs, but it doesn't fundamentally change the functionality. We just embed the execution layer into the consensus layer. The payloads are embedded in the beacon blocks, but the beacon blocks and the attesters, everything still works the same. Of course, there's more. So with different pieces of software, you can have the execution layer and consensus layer sync separately. Paul Honor is doing really great work, and I'd love to see like a PEEPanEIP about this eventually when it's ready. And then, of course, we need to really double down on testing. Testnets are one form, but there are also other forms like fuzzing, Hive, and more. And in the future, we should, once we have this larger testnet and maybe another testnet in a few months, we need infrastructure to get ready. So everyone needs to understand how they run this double layer system. Next slide. Okay. So I thought we're close to the end of the year. That would be great to show where we are in terms of this whole year. We have lots and lots of testnets and upgrades. It was wild. It started for the merge of Rayonism, which meant this relatively hacky solution. It was a hackathon kind of thing, where we would take execution clients and consensus clients, pull them together through a very primitive form of the engine API, the first draft, and disable the networking layer on the execution side, but just have the chain move and be able to process transactions, the bare minimum. And it worked. We got a testnet for a little bit less than a week. Then we had Altair development and London development, these upgrades on mainnet for Ethereum 1 and Ethereum 2. And then once those were completed, we got to Amphora. This was an event in Greece where we got several different client implementers together to revisit the merge specs and to work on this interop, this idea that all the clients could talk to each other, to go through all the compatibility issues. And this is where Parithosh comes in with the deployment of the first real large testnet. First Amphora, and then when we realized that the configuration should be tweaked, we set up a larger one called Pithos. It's the same thing as an Amphora, just a larger version. And then now we're in this run up to Kintsugi, the long-term merge testnet. But to do that well, you have to iterate, and there are these devnets that Parithosh is setting up every week, and he can tell you all about.
Thanks. Hey. So just to recap, we started off in the beginning of or more or less like the middle of the year with Rayonism. Then we split up with London main network. Then we had the Altair hard fork. But in between, we had Amphora and Pithos testing devnets. And you can also see how the spec versions are changing. And if you're ever interested in looking at what the changes were or how development actually progressed, you can go through the different spec versions. Yeah, this is essentially how we evolved over time. And now we're at almost the end of the year, and we're looking at the Kintsugi testnet. Devnets, what's happening with the devnets? We've had 4 so far, merged devnet 0 to 3. The aim of the devnets was to go through the transition often and try different combinations. So either change the number of validators, try a different type of transactions. In one of them, we had multiple miners, change the client distribution, see what happens basically. And this was happening parallel to the spec changes. So each devnet also sometimes had API changes, sometimes had different requirements to join them. So different clients were ready. It was essentially iterate and see what breaks each week. If something breaks, try and fix it for the next week. We started off initially with merge devnet 0, and that already broke with an edge case thanks to Marius. He's really earned the name testnet destroyer by now, or devnet destroyer. We're still investigating it. We're gonna definitely try and recreate that a bunch more times and add it as a static testing scenario for the future. Because that devnet was broken, we relaunched a few days later. The devnet broke because there was a bug with get, but it worked fine after relaunching it on the same day. Merge devnet 2 worked quite smoothly, actually. This is when it started getting a bit more confident. Big things weren't changing anymore. There were more iterative changes. Around this time is when testing efforts really ramped up. I'll talk a bit more about that later. And public people were joining in. Merge devnet 2 was, I think, the first time someone outside of the core client development team were creating validator deposits. They were running their own deposits, writing their own documentation, and really being a part of the devnet. Merge devnet 3 had some issues in the middle. We did find some bugs with different client combinations, and there was a communications issue in the beginning. But after everything was updated, it was stable. We were actually finding a lot more bugs with our tooling rather than anything else, but all of that looks a lot more stable now. Now one might question, what are these devnets even achieving? Well, one of the big things they help is figuring out interop between different client combinations. The last devnet had something like 12 combinations, and Kintsugi will have 16 combinations. So we're already getting to a lot more. I think the maximum number of combinations we have right now is 25. So hopefully the next public testnet, we'd actually get that. We want to check the stability of the network in different scenarios. It's also a target for optimistic sync, the one that Proto was talking about that Paul is working hard on. It's useful for iterating on our tooling because merge devnets are new. We also need new ways to actually look at if the devnet is working or broken, or how do we debug them. And ideally, we'll start moving towards devnets that mirror mainnet client distributions. Or if we notice certain types of setups are more common, we try to recreate those setups. So we're trying to get as close to mainnet as possible and go through the merge as often as possible. Again, thanks to Marius, who's running a fuzzing transaction fuzzer. We've got a lot of activity on the devnets. Merge devnet 3 particularly right now has over 100,000 transactions, over 50,000 blocks, 70 something thousand addresses, has 20,000 validators, and so far between 90 and 95% participation rate. I think there's like one client combination that has an outstanding bug, but that they are seriously looking into it, and that's not so bad. Like 1 out of 12 has an issue. We were able to find config bugs, tooling bugs, some issues with the client implementations. There were a lot that we were able to find out through these couple of devnets. Devnet 3 also had a lot of public participation from the testing the merge efforts. And I will talk about that after I tell you about Kintsugi. So Kintsugi is our first attempt with the new specs of a long-running public testnet. It's based on the latest specs after our 4 or 5 rounds of iteration now. The testnet has 72,000 validators with a 12 client combination. I think now it's a bit more even. Okay, so tenses are going to be a bit confusing because the testnet launches tomorrow, but the video for everyone else will come out next week. So technically I'm talking in the future tense, but for you guys, it will be in the past. So it will have launched by the time you're watching this. Our main idea is to have this testnet running for a longer duration of time, at least until mid-Jan, maybe end of Jan, depending on how things go. Use this for testing all of your smart contracts, your validator infrastructures, tooling, block explorers. If you're an RPC provider, what do you need to change? If you can think of interesting transactions, try them out. If you can think of attacks on different clients, try them out. For example, Barnaby and Casper from the Ethereum Robust Incentive Group, they tried out one of their reorg attacks on the previous testnet. And I'm sure they're also excited to try that on this testnet. It'll be one of many public testnets, but the earlier you start, the better the head start. And the earlier you break something, the more easily we can iterate. So please take part in Kintsugi. I will share information on how to join soon. Raphael from the Ethereum DevOps teams developed a really nice landing page. So it's just kintsugi.themerge.dev. I'll have a static link and I'm sure it'll be on the YouTube video as well. We have a basic add network to MetaMask button that sets your RPC, chain ID, blah, blah, blah. So from there on, you're interacting with your new chain. And you can question, okay, but I need some sort of ether to interact with it, right? So we have a faucet. Just go in there, paste your Ethereum address, and you'll get 50 testnet ether, maybe 100 testnet ether. We can tweak that based on how much you might need. And once you have some ether, make your transactions. We have a block explorer. So it's a typical transaction block explorer that you're used to. There's just a screenshot from an older testnet. That's why it's pre-filled with different information. But you can paste your address, have a look at it, view different smart contracts that are developed, look at blocks, see how things are working. And if you're someone who doesn't want to run their own node, we also have a public RPC. So if you just want to send a couple of transactions and you don't want to fiddle around with setting up infrastructure, we've hosted it for you. So we're trying to abstract things as much as possible. And the reason we're trying to abstract things is because of Marius's effort testing the merge. We want to get as many people involved in testing as soon as possible. So feel free to join. We have all the tooling in place, and we even have a document with a bunch of testing scenarios that we've thought of. If you think of even different testing scenarios, ping us or edit that or add a comment or whatever. And you could question, okay, who's this really for? Regular users, feel free to test the merge chain. If you're anxious about how the merge will change Ethereum, have a try, like do a transaction, notice that nothing much changes in your life. Be happy, I guess. For the technically involved people, we have a lot more elaborate tests for you. Feel free to take part, have a look, write documentation for whatever you do, share that with whoever. We definitely need to improve UX of our tooling. We're increasing complexity by having these two systems interact now. So it would be great to also have new tooling that helps us visualize how these systems are interacting. We're also lacking a lot of scripts to check data analysis tools of how things are happening on chain. So if you're someone who's interested in that, help. If you're someone who's good with writing or making videos, help document stuff, because there's just so much information and so much happening that we need ways to get this information out. So it's basically everyone. We have something for each and everyone. Just take part. You might not know where to ask questions, so you could tweet at either myself, Marius, or Raphael. We're more than happy to help you out. But by default, delete all your data directories and start from scratch with the latest commit. That's usually like 90% of the problems. If not, there's the Ethereum R&D Discord server. We have a testing channel there. And the ETH community has been super helpful. They also have a testing channel testing the merge, and you could post over there as well. We're usually monitoring a combination of all three. We apologize if we're not super fast, but hopefully you're also involved in helping answer questions for other people. So, and just to give you an overview of what the timeline's looking like, we're currently Q4 21. We have Devnets, we have a public testnet. We're going to continue with public testnets for the next couple of months. Try, as Proto said, have a lot more fuzzing, have a lot more testing, and hopefully we get to the merge next year. And we're open for questions.
Well, thank you so much. This was indeed a very interesting presentation. It beautifully provided the overview of most of the dev works that were done for the merge, like upgrade testnet timeline and the resources thing. It was super cool. Well, the presentation already have answered most of the questions that we had, but I have a few more. If I can go back to the Rayonism and Amphora. So Rayonism, as I understand, was a big success, and I think it was a one-of-a-kind workshop slash hackathon back in summer. That left quite an impression, and like we felt that the switching to POS is now in action. My question is, how do you see Rayonism similar or different to Amphora?
I think it's just a different stage of development where during Rayonism, we had to convince clients to move ahead of the regular plan with, like, the clients were working on Altair, they were working on London, these upgrades during the year. And of course, they saw priorities, but we got some devs together to start familiarizing themselves with the merge. And this helped later on during Amphora to give this context to client developers and understand what the engine API is about, how it could look like, and also just to turn people up that we do need, like, development, we do need eyes and feedback on how this thing works. And the earlier you start, the better. Really, like, we started Rayonism with this testnet called Steklo, which is glass. It fell within one day. Then we started another testnet. It worked for a week. And like you need to iterate and things will, like it's the prototype, things will go wrong, but we learn from it. And then with every other testnet after, we only improved and improved and improved. And with Amphora, we opened up the network layer on the execution layer. So that means these execution clients can state sync. So this means, and we have a transaction pool as well. All of the functionality is there in Amphora. And then again, it was, okay, now we have the full functionality set. We need to iterate again because things will be like less stable when you start off. But over time, and especially with these devnet iterations, now with Kintsugi, we're getting much closer to where we want to be.
That's interesting. One thing I can give the developers for sure is like, you guys are really creative in selecting names for all these testnets. I mean, every time we come up with some brand new name and we have to Google what's the meaning of that. That's
You can go back to the calendar slide of the testnets this year.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, right.
So we had cities, we had stars, we had art, we had Australian rivers, we had, and now we have pottery.
But you can clearly see a pattern in the devnet that I'm proposing. I just use a standard naming scheme. What the thing is for, devnet 0, 1, 2, 3, and so on. I'm not that creative, sorry.
No, that's fine. I mean, at least it gives the context that this is like further enhancement of this particular phase. Like we cannot expect major changes in specs. It's just that minor iterations are there. Interesting.
Kintsugi has a beautiful meaning. Kintsugi is like the mending of pottery. So we are merging now.
That's right. So talking about Amphora, I understand like Amphora was like in-person meet. I don't know if it was the first time that it ever happened for any upgrade, like both the consensus layer and the execution layer team like joined together. So I'd be curious to understand what would you consider as the biggest advantage of having the in-person meeting for a testnet launch?
Well, so testnet launches, there are rare events. It's not like everyday work or not like a regular call. And things will go wrong or there will be incompatibility issues. So then you can directly discuss these and have a much better chance of succeeding. And especially during Amphora, this was this week to just set up as many local testnets as possible to go through these interactions between clients. Tests often capture what a client in isolation does, but what we really need is integration testing.
And I think it was awesome to be in person. When a single thing broke, you could just point at someone in the room, they're right there to help out. Whereas with the reality of Ethereum development, right, like online, everyone's all over the world and trying to coordinate a quick answer for like a 2-minute question that, you know, the exact person would have it, but they're in the wrong time zone and they might only reply to you next morning. Whereas being in person, you're like, did I know this quick information? And then just move on. That really, really helped in the beginning.
I agree. I mean, in general, like in this decentralized world, when everyone in the Ethereum community is like living in, I don't know which part of the world, if they get to meet each other and start working in sync, things go faster. Let's move on to the next testnet, the Pithos. We saw some testnet related resources coming out, going public, saying that how to set up testnet articles. So these resources, as we discussed, are really very valuable for prepping the community and inviting the participation. How would you describe the community response to the Pithos testnet? I mean, did the how to set up testnet kind of guide amplify the community participation in active devnet conversation?
I think it definitely did. It was also extremely surprising because it was the first time I was involved in a public testnet of that scale. And like Proto and I looked through all the configs and we launched the testnet, and everything was fine. So I went to bed. And the next day morning, someone's made videos, walkthroughs, there's PRs with fixes for some Docker Compose files I had put up. Someone's edited the READMEs to make them nicer. Like, I did not expect any of this. It was insane how people just like took ownership of the thing and really spread information, and they were driving a lot of the conversation. I'm hoping that's been awesome, and I hope that continues for the next couple of testnets as well. It's also the case with testing the merge. There's a lot of people now who've had experience with running clients on the devnets, and when there's questions, they're taking ownership and asking. They're taking ownership and answering the questions without us having to answer each question individually. So it's been great. Community response has been awesome, and I think that really helps.
Yeah, that's the beauty of Ethereum community. If you start something, people will join, and together we make things great.
Definitely. And there was like some really small things that at least I as a developer don't think of. For example, in my README, I just had a line that says, get your IP address and put it in this variable file. It didn't occur to me that some people might not know how to get their public IP address, right?
Yes.
Like, yeah. So someone's making a README to a PR to fix the README to add some more verbose information. It's stuff like that also helps change the mindset as to who's getting involved. Reduces the barrier to entry.
Yeah, and make it easier for new people to join it. That's interesting.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, community. So moving on to the next testnet, the Kintsugi. So many versions of Kintsugi are already nuked, and I was thinking that the version 3 and the 4th testnet, as you say, like V3 and devnet 4, would be the last devnet, which I think is still right, because tomorrow it's going to be the public testnet out. But I'm a little confused by one of your statements mentioning that this is one of the many testnets. What does that mean? Like, are we expecting more public testnets?
So I think we're going to stop with weekly testnets until the end of the holiday season. So we want to have something stable that we have mature documentation for, that people can test on, and we keep this running for a while. But at the end of that, we're going to, again, see if there's stuff we have to change on the spec, and then try and go back to a weekly cadence again. Just go through the merge as often as possible. And I do see that there'd be more public testnets coming before we like really feel like we're 100% ready for the merge.
This doesn't mean that we necessarily have to shut down the testnet.
Exactly.
If the testnet is running well, then we'll probably keep it up for like infrastructure providers and those that just need something to work with. But like these smaller subtle changes in the spec, we can iterate on in separate devnets.
Exactly.
So one follow-up question on that. How would you know, like, this is the right time, we are ready? Is there any baseline in terms of number of weeks, or like, how do you realize that it is working fine and now we are ready to move on to the next version?
Proto, maybe you have a better answer for that.
It's the classic answer, rough consensus, right?
Yeah.
So we have, I think, what I really like that during the consensus call and the all core devs call, we allocate time for discussion about the merge, which includes spec changes and testnets. And over time, I think the spec changes have become lesser and lesser. There's more subtle every time. At this point, they're not affecting consensus anymore. It's just maybe an API tweak here and there. But really, I think it's starting to be stable enough for this like longer running testnet. And we should just use these calls that we have to discuss the future testnets.
And we're slowly getting to a stage where they're stable enough that we can have more creative testing environments to try and break them. Also have a lot more fuzzing going on. I think the longer that it exists in that phase, that we've thrown everything we can think of at it and it hasn't broken, the more confident we'd feel with, yeah, cool, let's figure out a mainnet date then.
Interesting. And there is one interesting question in the chat by Marius. How can we get even more people involved in that testnet? Do you think bounties, POAPs would encourage more people to join?
I mean, I don't think I have to convince anyone for POAP. There are hits in the Ethereum2 sphere, at least. I would say yes. If you have ideas on like how to encourage it, then hop in the Discords. We have these channels for development, but we're also very eager to hear like how can we expand the testing. And that just also means testnet user acquisition, really, where the more crazy things users can deploy or try on our testnet, the better. And yeah, so I think POAPs would be a start, maybe like an exercise to see if we can port as many dApps as possible over to the testnet and just see if it works.
Yeah, that would be cool.
And I mean, a lot of credit to Marius here for doing fuzzing transactions.
Yes. It's been awesome. His first transactions so far haven't broken DevNet 3, but they've broken 2 tools like 3 or 4 times that we use to like observe like explorers and stuff like that. Just because, oh, the gas limit was above the variable type that we're using, or this was different, and then suddenly the explorer is down or the RPC is down. So it's definitely making stuff better.
Raising the bar here.
Yep.
All right. So we have got another interesting question in the chat. Was there a fix for the 2 miners problem you mentioned in one of your testnets?
So according to the spec, we shouldn't have had that problem. And we're still investigating as to why it happened and what the scenario was. But this was still based on, by now, like 3 versions older spec. So we're yet to recreate a devnet with the latest spec, try the exact same scenario and see if it breaks as well. Hopefully we can narrow it down and figure out what's actually going on. But right now there's no, it shouldn't happen, but it's happened.
I think we can separate these 2 things. We have the merge transition and the post-merge testing. And I would like everyone to pay attention to both. But every testnet that launches goes through the transition once and then offers the post-merge for a long time. So I think we, as developers within the merge, we should prioritize the transition and then automate that to test that thoroughly. Whereas users can join these existing long-running testnets and try the post-merge testing.
That's interesting. And I guess there is a follow-up. Is there a plan to rerun the scenario?
Yes, we definitely be rerunning it a few more times, and it'll be a standard thing that every devnet we would try and recreate it to make sure it just never happens again.
Also, for testing, I think the shadow fork ID, where dev developers take an existing testnet, create their own version by extending their own non-canonical chain. We can repeat that in a similar way, where we take Gorli or Ropsten and build a shadow fork. So we keep the proof of work or proof of authority testnet running, but we also start forking it off in a proof of stake chain. And that is one way to repeatedly test the transition on larger testnets with like real behavior.
Exactly, and we're also improving some of our tooling. Rafael from the EF, for example, has been building a lot of ways to spin up automated testnets. So we can just hand that over and say, yeah, run these couple of commands, you have a testnet running in like 10 minutes. And such tooling helps you go through this exact merge transition a lot more often with a lot less manual interaction, so to say.
Because we are testing this merge since summer and now this is the year end, people should be assured that it's going to be fully tested before it comes on the main net. A lot of testings are going on. All right, so that's about the merge, but I mean, my next question is about future upgrades and testnets. So it may be a little early to learn about that, but I know the community is also curious to know what's next. So let's talk a little bit about the post-merge, starting from the upgrades. It would be interesting to get some idea about network upgrade structure after the merge. Now that we have two different chains running in parallel, how do we see our upcoming upgrades?
Well, so with the start of the presentation, we try to separate this consensus layer and execution layer ID. And I think it's important for the upgrades as well. Some upgrades, they may just be independent, where we only update one layer. Some other features may require both layers to be updated. And after the merge, we have this broad picture that we need a hard fork that introduces withdrawals. This affects both layers. But we may also have hard forks that change the EVM, which only affects the execution layer. And so there's this separation, and we have fork scheduling that works exactly the same as we used to have, where the beacon chain or the consensus layer has an epoch number, a set time to update. And now with the execution layer, things may change a little bit because we don't rely on like a block number anymore. We can use the beacon chain if we wanted to for an update, although I think block height is still reasonable. So I think after we go through the merge, we'll have some discussion about how to schedule the exact updates.
Right. I understand the last upgrade on the proof of work chain, or the Arrow Glacier upgrade, it didn't go on the Ropsten or any of the public testnet. But I remember the Get team deploying a new testnet. Not sure if it is active for any upgrade testing at this time or not. And also on the consensus layer side, there was this discussion of discontinuing the Piermont testnet and maybe continuing with Praja for some time. So would you like to give us some sneak peek about what kind of testnet, public testnet we can see in future for both the execution layer and the consensus layer?
Well, I don't think we have the rough consensus yet, like when it will happen. But I do think that we have the consensus that we do want testnets like Gorli or like Ropsten to also adopt the merge. So not just the shadow fork, but an eventual proof of stake chain to really run the same thing in production as we do in testnets. I think it's too early to say like when we should call this, but we're definitely looking forward to it.
There is a question in the chat. I think that is probably related here. Is the plan still to run the merge on Ropsten before that difficulty bomb goes off next year? When would that decision be made, whether to diffuse that bomb or go forward with the merge there? So as I understand, the Arrow Glacier that was deployed on December 9th was the last upgrade related to difficulty bomb before merge. And my understanding is that we do not expect the difficulty bomb to show up before the merge. We actually have recorded an interesting conversation with TJ Rush, who actually did the calculation behind the difficulty bomb, like how is it calculated and why did developers agree to push it till June, because the initial proposal for 4345 was to push it till May. The developers have already considered some gap that should be there in case merge is delayed by a month or two, but we do not expect the difficulty bomb to like come again ever on the network. That's my understanding. I know we have more devs here. If anyone has to add anything, please.
Right, so maybe Marius can comment on this from the Gov team. I'm not sure.
I am not sure if Marius has microphone today. Yeah.
Okay.
That's what I
Oh,
thought.
well. I mean, we should raise this during the next consensus or all core devs call.
Definitely.
I think it's a good topic for for just regular planning. And I don't think it's urgent, nor do I think it affects mainnet that much. So it will come.
True. So there's one more thing that I can talk about. So Marius and I and a couple of others are already planning on shadow forking Gorli, for example. So this is exactly what Proto was speaking about earlier, so that we can shadow fork an existing testnet, keep doing this multiple times. So we have like a non-canonical merged chain that would definitely help with testing. So we're actively going to go down that route and see how much testing we can achieve with that. So that should indicate how well it would go down on a public chain.
That would be interesting to follow. We have heard about this shadow fork talk earlier in Geth. I'm not sure if it was already implemented. I heard Peter proposing this proposal a while ago, but it's good to see that something similar to this is also being tested for merge.
So I think the interesting part is here is that dApps do this all the time, where they plug into an archive node and split off a chain with their version of the contracts, some cheat codes maybe, but then have the existing layer 1 state to test with. And this is also for the merge just really valuable to have the real state. And this means we'll shadow fork testnets and maybe also shadow fork mainnet. That will be like the ultimate test before we go live.
Yes. But for now, if you're a dApp developer, please do deploy in Kintsugi as well. For now, let's not put all our hopes on just shadow forking, but also it is a clean new testnet to test everything.
Yeah, of course. Like whatever is here, make your contribution, and whatever comes up next will obviously be a part of that. I just want to make a mention of one more thing. We did talk about optimistic syncing post-merge, like Paul Honor is working on that, right? So we did an episode on merging Ethereum a while ago with Paul, and he did talk about like possible scenarios. I'm not sure if there is any decision, because when he made this video, then there was no such decision. But just to get an idea of what the proposal is, people can always go back and watch the recording in the PEEPanEIP. So that's an interesting conversation. And obviously we'll try to have him back on the show to talk more about it, what we can expect there.
Right now he's leading the conversation on the optimistic sync. And so it started with an issue in the Lighthouse repository, now a full write-up shared between client teams that I think you can find it in the Alcordevs channel, where he goes in depth in how it could work. And I think this is really valuable to have somebody that can champion such a feature. And it definitely deserves a video on its own.
I'd agree. All right, we are very close to an hour mark. Anyone on the call, if you guys have any further question, comment for the guests. Thank you so much, Proto. Thank you so much, Pari, for joining us, and Marius too. I know you don't have microphone, but at least I can thank you. You can hear us. Thank you so much for sharing all the valuable resources and information. And I hope to see you guys showing up on this series and keep sharing the latest research work with the community.
Great, thank you so much.
Yeah. Thanks for having us.
Yeah. Well, we will try to release the video as early as possible. We can see like by Monday latest, that will be shared with the rest of the community. When you are watching it on Monday, you have to assume that the public testnet is already live and the documentation will be listed in the description section, so you can follow and do the setups. And if you have questions, feel free to come back with your questions. Either you can leave it in the comment in the YouTube channel itself, or show up on any of the Discords that we mentioned today. It would be really interesting to see participations coming from community. And I just want to share that in the Ethereum cat headers Discord also, we have created this merge channel. So people who are looking for any kind of help, and if they are here, they can post questions. I'd like to thank our guest one more time for sharing these information about the testnet, and also talk a little bit about what we can expect with future upgrades, even after post-merge. And thank you to all the participants of the call who joined and added a lot of good questions. Those are really helpful. I hope the release of this video will help people get up to the speed and join the testnet. On this note, a huge thank you to all our YouTube viewers for watching PEEPanEIP. The vision of this series is to provide you more information on what's coming up on the Ethereum blockchain. So if you like the episode, please hit the like and do not forget to share with community members. Guest Twitter handles, slides, and other related resources are already added in the description section. We'll be back with another interesting topic for you. Till then, keep watching, keep sharing your love with Ethereum cat headers. See you soon with another episode. Have a good one.